Hello everyone! I don't think I'm capable of being super static for this intro, so I'm just gonna move around a little bit and I hope you don't mind. So, in this month's video, we're going to explore the topic of exaggeration and stylization of your designs. So basically, we're just going to push them more and make them more cartoony and interesting looking. I feel like sometimes I fall in this pit with my art where everything I draw is kind of semi-realistic. It's not super cartoony, it's not realistic, it's somewhere in the middle, but it's nowhere really. And I figured I can just use the occasion and practice my own skills while also filming the process and walking you through it. I'm going to design a bunch of characters, some from imagination and some from photo reference, and I'm going to show you how I approach stylization and simplification. I will try to have a lot of diversity in their face shapes and also body types and silhouettes. So the entire video is going to be pretty much just me drawing, experimenting, and commenting on what I'm doing. I try to make it very practical in the sense that you can take whatever I'm saying in the video and apply it to your own art. And I'm really excited to work on these characters because they are like a continuation of my current style, and yet they feel very different because they are more like characters for an animation movie instead of like illustrations of cute characters. And I really hope you will find it helpful. I'm gonna try and keep this video really casual because I don't want to overwhelm you with information, and I certainly don't want to be speaking for 50 minutes straight because I think that might be a little bit too much. I want to give you some occasional silent spots where you can process what I previously said, and I also want to allow the process to speak for itself. So with that being said, for the first drawing, I'm actually sketching J.K. Simmons, who is a really famous actor. I'm pretty sure you've seen him in the movie Whiplash or a bunch of other films. I'm looking at his picture on the side, and the first thing that I notice is that he has a pretty big forehead, and also his chin is quite long. And I want to emphasize those two things, so in order to do that, I'm gonna make his nose a little bit shorter. And I also allow myself to experiment a lot here, because the way that I'm doing this video is I'm actually doing a bunch of studies and I want to improve my own skills. So I don't always know what I'm doing and I allow myself to try new things and see what works and what doesn't. I purposefully didn't trim out the parts of the video where I'm erasing parts and redoing them, because I want you to see what the actual process looks like, and it's not always super clean and straightforward. And you can see here that I'm experimenting with the shape of the nose because I want this character to be more simplified and cartoony. So I want to stay away from super realistic anatomical details. I don't want to draw all of the details of the nose. So I'm trying to think of the shapes a little bit more abstractly. And in the case with J.K. Simmons, you will notice that his nose shape is quite distinct, because you can really see the two nostrils very separated from the middle part of his nose. I'm not sure how to explain that, but I will put a picture of him on the screen so you can see. And I just look at that shape and I try to exaggerate what I'm seeing and simplify it a little as well. Something else that I also notice about him in every picture that I look at is this tiny little diamond-like shape above his upper lip. You know how most people have these two lines coming down from the nostrils to the corners of the upper lips? With some people these are very visible, but with others they are pretty, flat. It's just a flat shape above your upper lip. But with him, I noticed that in almost every picture. So I decided to incorporate that into my design, even though you could argue that it's a little bit of an anatomical detail and it doesn't have any place in such a cartoony drawing. I still feel that it looks alright. And I tried to give him round eyes in the beginning, But there is something about his eyes, you know, they're very squinted, and I think I lose some of the likeness to the real person if I give him these really cartoony, round, open eyes, because his eyes are never so wide open, whatever picture I pick to look at. And his drawing ended up looking a little bit more semi-realistic than I wanted to. So for the next drawings, I just keep that in mind and I try to push them a little bit further and make them more cartoony. Because as I said, I'm also learning in the process and I try to note what I did wrong. It's not exactly wrong, but it's not how I wanted it to be. So I try to pay attention to those things and keep them in mind for the next drawings. Something else that I could also do is just do the same drawing all over again, but this time trying to push it even more and simplify further. But I just didn't feel like doing that here, so I move on with the other characters now. The second design that I draw, the face is again really elongated, but this time the chin is really squarish and is really wide. So as you can see, the entire chin is almost as wide as the jawline and most of the face. So what makes this face look interesting? In my opinion, this is the difference between the shapes and sizes of things. For example, notice that his forehead is quite small, and also the distance between the nose and the chin is also really small, so he has like a short chin. But then the nose is really long, and when you combine that with the entire face that is long, I think that looks really interesting. And because the face is pretty much like a rectangle, I want to contrast that a little bit, so I give him this fluffy hair. And overall, I think that looks interesting and makes the design a little bit more distinctive. Now I want to draw something that is a full body character because I want to step away from the portraits and experiment even further with the proportions of the human body. So I think about things very simply in the beginning. I think about an idea, like a really small idea. In this case, this is a big chest and shoulders and small feet. I need to have contrast in something in order to make it look more interesting, so this is the idea that I have. It doesn't have to be something super complex, just something to get you started. So I begin with the chest, kind of like a square or a rectangle, and then I'm drawing the legs really simple. And with this character, I'm also thinking about his personality. Well, I tend to do that always whenever I'm designing characters, but in this exercise especially. I want him to be like an office guy, but maybe a little bit messy, so he's not the most tidy person. He's a little bit more casual, and this is just his entire personality. And the way that I'm showing this is, first of all, he's wearing a shirt and a tie, but he's wearing sweatpants, which is not something people normally do in an office, I would imagine. So I think that already gives him a little bit more personality. And also the way he's wearing his tie and his shirt, it's not like neatly tucked in, and the tie is not super tight around his neck. The shirt is a little bit unbuttoned. And I'm also adding a lot of wrinkles to the shirt because this adds the element of story to the drawing. Even though it's just one drawing of the person, you already know some stuff about him. And I'm using the hair in the same way as like a storytelling element because, as you can tell, it's a little bit messy and all over the place. So maybe he was late for work and he didn't have time to fix it, or maybe he never fixed it. Maybe he's just, this is how he's walking around with his messy hair always. And of course, I'm also thinking about the visuals of the drawing, not only about the storytelling, because one supports the other and they work well together, but not really well separately. So in this case, I'm also trying to create some kind of contrast in the face and its shapes. I want something in his facial features that really stands out and something that you will see this character and you will notice that immediately, because this is what makes the character more memorable to the viewer. With this character, I just make his jawline really wide, but I'm keeping the chin pointy. I'm also keeping the hair really short, so most of the head is just his face and his big jaw. And then you have like a really small shape of the hair. If you kind of look at it a little bit abstractly, because this is kind of how I'm seeing this, I also make his nose bigger, but I'm keeping the eyes small. And I'm also keeping in mind other stuff, like for example, the position of the fingers and just the overall posture of the character. Sure, it's just a front view drawing, you might argue, but people stand differently in front view. I always imagine them as people waiting for the bus. I don't know why, but this is just how it works in my mind. So whenever I'm drawing a character and I have to draw them in front view, I think about what would they look like if I saw them at the bus stop. They're just standing there. They don't have a phone because I don't want them to be holding any props or anything like that. But how do they stand? Because, you know, if it's like a shy girl, maybe she will be standing with her feet crossed and she will be crossing her arms too, like a very closed posture, trying to protect herself from the outside world. But if it's someone super extroverted, for example, maybe they will have their hands on their waistline and the feet will be further apart, like a really wide stance. And this is something really important, and it also tells you a lot about the personality of the character. So even if I'm sketching someone in front view, I will still keep in mind their body language and their general posture and how they carry themselves through space. And the last thing that I wanted to mention about the previous drawing that is in full body is that to contribute to this feeling of him being a little bit messy, casual, a little bit confused even, I am rotating his head a little bit to the side, which is something really, really small, but I believe it adds a lot of personality. So it's just small details like that that you need to always keep in mind with your designs. And with this next guy, I am simplifying the mouth a lot, as you can tell. I'm not drawing any lips on these characters actually at all. This is something that I always debate when I start drawing, should I draw the lips or not? Because obviously if it's girls, you can draw the lips and it works fine, but when it's males and if you draw the lips, it can look really weird sometimes depending on what your goal with the drawing is. So usually I avoid drawing them with male characters, or I will only do it if I'm doing like a full rendered drawing that is colored and painted, because then it's a little bit more subtle. Whereas if I draw them with the black line, it looks like they're wearing lipstick, which is totally fine, but not always my goal. So with that guy that I drew, you will notice that the lower part of his head is really big, like the chin and the nose, but then the top part of his head is really small, the forehead and the beanie. And actually, to emphasize how big his jaw is, I am giving him the beanie because, you know, when you put on a beanie, it's like really squishing your hair and it's really very tightly following the volume of your skull underneath. So it just makes everything look smaller. Whereas if you don't have a beanie, you know, you have all the volume of your hair and all of that, which is fine. But here I want to contrast the two. So I want to make the top part of his head smaller. And to help me with that, I'm using the beanie. And this really helps to emphasize how big the nose and the entire face is, pretty much, without the forehead. And I'm also pushing the jawline forward. You can see the incline of the nose. I'm not sure if incline is the right word, but notice how the nose is coming forward a lot and is like this huge triangular shape. And this is because I always think of the face and the head as a 3D object, not just something flat in front view. I do tend to design a lot of characters in front view because it's just how my brain works. I like to separate it into different steps, but I always think about it in terms of volume, not just a flat shape on the page. I told you that I want to keep this video really casual and give you some silent spots, but it's just really difficult to follow along with my process and comment on everything that I want to share, because I guess a lot of things are going on in my mind while I'm drawing, and when I speed up the video it's a little bit difficult. But just to quickly analyze this next character, for her I wanted to have the torso really rectangular. I think with women we also tend to go for the cliche of the tiny waist, the big boobs and wide hips, which again is totally fine, but it's just one way of doing things. I think in general with women it's a little bit more difficult to experiment, but here I wanted to try something a little bit different. So I'm drawing the torso, as I said, as a rectangle, and I want her to have wide hips, sort of like not super wide, but the same width as the torso and the chest. But then to contrast all of that, I'm gonna make her calves, like the lower leg, and also the feet super narrow and super tiny and elongated. So this is the idea that I have for this character, because every drawing that I make starts with a simple idea like that. And this difference between the two makes the whole design look more interesting, because if I were to make her lower leg a normal width for these thighs, you know, what would work realistically, then the character would look pretty generic and a little bit boring, because if you make everything wide, then nothing is really wide because you have nothing to compare it to and it just looks even. But if you want to make something really wide, if you want to emphasize how wide that thing is, then make something else smaller. This is the same thing, for example, if you want to make her boobs appear bigger, you're gonna give her a really tiny waist because you have the difference between the two shapes and it really emphasizes the idea. It's kind of like this cheesy quote that, what was it? Stars only shine in the darkness or whatever. It's the same principle. And it's something that honestly I think about every single time, whatever I'm designing. It could be about bodies, but it could also be about faces. Like, for example, with this guy that I'm drawing here, I want to emphasize how long his chin is. And in order to do that, I am making the nose a little bit shorter, and especially the forehead is really tiny here. So you have this contrast between the shapes, and it really helps to sell your idea that this is a guy with a long chin. Something that I think about a lot while drawing these characters is how to simplify anatomy and to what degree. Because you can go really crazy with that, but somehow I never do it. I always stick to some sort of semi-realism, or I don't know how to call it. I don't think I can just easily label it like that, but I've always wanted to push my designs more, and this is my focus here. So I'm always trying to pick something that I want to exaggerate in the person, especially whenever I'm drawing people from photo reference. I kind of try to take a look at the photo and I focus on what is the first thing that stands out to me, what is the first thing that I notice about this person. And you can really emphasize different things in one person. I think I've talked about that before, but if you take like 10 character designers and you give them the same photo reference of a person and you ask them to create a character based on that person, everyone is going to create something different, not only because of their style, but also because something different will stand out in their own eyes. So maybe I will look at the person and notice that they have a huge nose, but maybe another character designer is going to notice that their eyes are set really close together, and their whole drawing will be about that. but my drawing will be about the big nose. So anyway, what I was trying to say is that I look at a picture and I try to notice the first thing that comes to my mind. And it's kind of like I really force myself to do it, you know? Because otherwise I can just look at the picture and forget to think about that. And I get too caught up in the details like, oh, what does their hair look like? And they're wearing a really interesting shirt. And I forget to notice that thing. And this is something that will really... I've made a habit to force myself to notice that the first second that I take a glance at someone. Like, for example, this guy with the hat here. Again, I'm giving him a long chin. I don't know what it is about long chins in this video, but probably every character has it here. And yet, you will see that they're all so different from each other because I have all of these other facial features that I'm playing around with. And this actually goes to show you that you can have the same thing in a bunch of people, and yet you can still make them look completely different from one another. Something that I sometimes do when I'm drawing people from reference is that first I observe the photo and I try to even write keywords if I have to, like the things that stand out to me. For example, I will draw, okay, this person has like a really long neck, slender sloping shoulders. Her chin is going to be super long again for whatever reason, and maybe she will have also a big forehead and her mouth will be really high. And whenever it's a real person, you're looking from a reference, you have those things, but you also have a bunch of other details that can be really confusing and you just don't know what to focus on, especially if this is not something that you've done many times before. So what I like to do is I like to write these things as keywords on the side, and then I hide the photo and I try to draw someone based on the keywords that I wrote, because this way I am not allowing the photo to influence my drawing too much. I have the most important elements because I wrote them down, but when I hide the photo, this allows me to really allow myself to experiment with the shapes and to exaggerate a lot more than I normally would if I was looking at the photo, because when I look at the reference, I kind of tend to have the urge to follow it too literally. And I don't think this always works well, especially when you want to create something that is a little bit more cartoony and simplified. Because all of those realistic details, clothing folds, whatever, this can be really confusing and it can take your mind away from the essence of the photo and the most important things. So far I'm talking about drawing people from reference, but what if I'm making something from imagination? Like for example, the girl with this long chin. In this case, I'm thinking about an idea that I have. So here I was like, okay, I want a girl with a big forehead and a long chin. And that's it. It's an abnormally long chin. I want to emphasize that. But I know nothing else about her. So what I do is I start sketching this thing that I have in mind, and naturally other things start happening in the drawing too, because I don't know, literally what I'm going to draw. I just have a vague idea. So when I start sketching, I notice what is happening on the canvas and I try to emphasize those ideas that just happen to be there. For example, I made her neck a little bit long, so I emphasize that, and it just works like that. You notice what you already have on the canvas and you push those ideas further. So maybe if her eyes were a little bit close together, then I will take them and push them even closer together. So it works like that for everything. It's the facial features, it's the shape of the face, the body, whatever. And one thing that I always try to avoid, that is evenness. Because when you distribute things evenly, and they are the same shape and size, roughly, that tends to look really generic and boring, and there's nothing interesting about it. This is kind of like a repetition to everything that I've said so far, but I just think that it's something super important. And it's honestly probably the most important thing that I remind myself whatever I'm drawing. It's just constantly in the back of my mind to avoid evenness. I'm drawing a face and I occasionally check, okay, is the forehead, the nose, and the chin the same length? Because if they are, then probably I can make that face look a little bit more interesting somehow. Now this next design is probably one of my favorite drawings that I ever made, and I'm not joking, I'm just in love with this guy. He looks so cool. I will show you the reference because I did use a reference photo for him, although he looks nothing like the photo in the end. But it's actually, I think, really cool to see that you don't have to actually follow the reference 100%. You can just take a look at the real person and maybe see something that you like, an idea about him. In this case, I really like the sunglasses and the mustache and just the head in general. And I also like the combination of a tucked in shirt with flowers and shorts. So as you can see, my drawing doesn't look the same as the person, but it does have the same elements. And the reason for that is because I did this thing that I mentioned a little bit earlier where I notice these things, but I don't look at the photo while I'm drawing. I just tell myself, okay, I'm drawing a guy who is wearing a tucked in shirt and shorts. And if you give that description again to a bunch of artists, you're gonna get very different results. So that means that the result that I'm going to get could be really different from the reference photo because there are many different ways that this can look, you know, a tucked in shirt with shorts. And I actually think that's part of the magic with drawing because you can have a reference but create something completely different even though it's inspired from the photo. So here I am really pushing the idea that he has a really big neck, but his shoulders are not going to be big because, you know, normally when you think of a big neck, you think of someone super beefy and strong, but I thought, what if I make the shoulders super small? I mean, this is something interesting because it's not the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of a big strong neck. And I actually think that it ended up looking so cool because you have a really strong contrast between those two volumes. And actually his shoulders are kind of non-existent in this drawing. This is something that I like to do sometimes. It's just an oversimplification of the anatomy. I've explained this concept in other videos and I know it's a little bit abstract, but if you think of the shoulder, it's in this drawing in particular, it's gonna be a little bump, you know, but it's just so small, like it's such a small bump that I can just get rid of it and straighten this line. I don't know if this is the most adequate explanation of what I'm trying to say. I just try to simplify things, so that's just the gist of it. And with the pants, I remember when I started drawing, I always hated drawing men in suits or like shorts or just men in general because they're all like so boxy, you know, they're just a bunch of rectangles put together and there you have a male character, but it looks so static and a little bit boring and stiff. But I finally deciphered it in the last couple of years. So now with the shorts here, yes, they are pretty much a rectangle, but the way that I make them interesting is I'm adding a bunch of folds to them. I think this is the secret, to be honest, because adding all of those folds inside the shape of the pants, it really helps to show you that there is a lot of fabric and something is happening to that fabric. There is movement in it. Actually, I think that's the important part, that you're showing some kind of movement, because movement is dynamic, and even if the character is just standing in front of you and they're not really posed, even despite that fact, if you add some kind of movement in the clothes, I think this really helps to make your drawing a little bit more dynamic. So my thought process here was that his shorts are a little bit longer, you know, hitting right above the knees. But then I made his shirt really short. So maybe he pulled his shorts a little bit higher than a normal person would, and he tucked in his shirt. But then his entire torso is also smaller, like shorter. And this creates a contrast between the shape of the shirt and the pants. Again, this is something that I think about constantly whenever I'm drawing, the proportions of things and how I can just play around with them. So if I see that the shirt is a little bit shorter than the pants, I will make it even shorter and I will make the pants even longer. I know I'm repeating myself here, but this is just what's happening inside my head when I'm drawing. And to make the design cooler and like give a little bit more personality to it, I want to juxtapose the idea of this really strong, beefy guy. Well, I mean, I don't know how strong you think he is because his arms are quite thin and his legs as well, but his neck is huge. So let's say that he's a strong guy in a way. And he also looks really cool with his hair and the sunglasses, the mustache. So I want to juxtapose that with something really soft and sweet. So I'm adding these flowers on his shirt, and I think the contrast between those two things is again something that can really help to make a character more interesting and give more personality. It's the same thing like if you draw a really cute girl with a huge gun or fixing her car or whatever, you know, you have the contrast between those two ideas and they're really clashing, but this clash is what makes the whole thing actually look more interesting. For this next design, I'm using a reference photo by this photographer born in the 50s. His name is Bruce Ryden. He's taking pictures of people and they all look super interesting. So I really like this girl, which when I look at her, I try to follow my gut feeling and the first thing that comes to my mind about her personality. Because usually if I start overthinking and overanalyzing, I tend to get confused and then I don't really have any clear, strong idea that I want to communicate with my drawing. It just looks all over the place. So I try to avoid that. And here I look at her and the thing that I pay attention to is that her face and neck are kind of elongated a little bit. So I'm going to emphasize that in my drawing. And I want to exaggerate the idea that she looks a little bit nerdy with the straight hair and the glasses. And also I need to make her body a little bit more interesting in the sense that the silhouette has to be a little bit more pushed, because I imagine that this is going to be maybe a character in an animation movie. So the viewer should be able to identify the character based only on their silhouette. So I take the idea that her shoulders are going to be narrow and her hips are going to be wider. The upper part of her body is kind of like a triangle. And as we said, because I want to strengthen the idea of the wide hips, I am going to make the feet really small. So when you look at the entire body of the character, it's kind of like a diamond shape. And this is something that I actively think about when I'm designing her. And when it comes to her face, I am giving her a really huge forehead because this is the thing that stands out to me when I look at her. Of course, I'm really exaggerating that. And here I'm drawing the eyes as simple circles just because I want to experiment and see what that would look like. And also, whenever I draw the eyes, like, you know, the regular almond shape with the eyelashes and the eyelids and all of that, I think this is a little bit more semi-realistic. It's too much anatomical detail. And in my personal opinion, or maybe it's just me, I tend to always stick to kind of the same eye shape when I do that with the almond eyes, and it tends to look really boring and just like another cute girl that I'm drawing. Maybe the problem is just me, that I don't know how to diversify that, so I guess it's something that I need to work on. But I've noticed that whenever I draw the eyes as circles or something similar to a circle, they are a little bit more cartoony and simplified, and they look more like the character is part of an animation project or something. And another important aspect of character design and art in general, that is repetition, and something that I always try to incorporate into my designs. So with this previous drawing, the girl with the big forehead, I am thinking about shapes that I can repeat, or just something that I can repeat. So in her case, because the face is so long, I also make the neck long, and I make the legs like a little bit elongated, and I think also the face is kind of like a diamond shape, in the sense that the cheekbones are the widest part, but then the forehead, like the top of her head, and also the chin are narrower. So the entire shape of the body is not very different from the shape of her face. And this is something that I did on purpose, because when you create repetition in your drawing, whatever it is, it could also be a background drawing, because it gives the viewer this sense of familiarity when they look at your drawing, and this is just easier on the eyes, I guess, and it puts some order into your drawing. It makes it easier to understand and decipher what they're looking at. And with the last design, again, it's based on a photo. So when I look at the real girl, again, I notice that her shoulders are a little bit higher, you know, like she is maybe a little bit nervous or something, but she also gives the sense of like this vibe of someone who is maybe like a sports person. Maybe she's in the local football team. I don't know. It could not be true. I mean, it doesn't have to be something that is actually like this, but it's just the feeling that you get. So when I look at her, I trust my gut feeling. This is the first thing that comes to my mind. So why not? I mean, why don't I just take this idea and go with it and draw a character based on that? So if she's a girl who is maybe, let's say, a football player, then I will try to make her physique fit that. So I'm gonna give her bigger thigh muscles, but to make them appear bigger, I'm gonna make the hips smaller, like narrower. And I also want to give her wider shoulders, but again, because the hips are smaller, then the shoulders will really appear wider, because there is a difference between the two. And the last thing that I do with her proportions is that I make the chest a little bit shorter to emphasize that she has long legs, even though in the reference picture you will see that her t-shirt is like covering part of her hips. So in reality, this shape of the torso, or let's say the shape of the t-shirt, it's pretty long, you know, it's not like a square or anything like that, but I don't have to follow that closely, you know, I can just take the idea and change it to suit my drawing. And because her torso, like her chest, is really boxy, again, I want to have some kind of repetition in the design, so I applied the same thing to her face, where you can see her entire head is kind of like a square. Everything is really wide, as opposed to the previous drawing where her face is like super elongated. Here it's the opposite of that, and everything is close together. And to emphasize this, I also exaggerate how her hair is going around the sides of her face, but is really short. So this makes the entire silhouette of her head a little bit wider. And it's true that in the reference picture, the girl has a big forehead, so I have to think of a way to not make the two girls look alike too much. So the way that I do that is, you guessed it, I make everything else really short. So her nose is tiny, and also her chin is quite short. And I'm also making the top part of her head pretty much like a square with straight angles, because again, I want to repeat the shape of the body, like the shoulders. I want to have the same thing at the top of her head. So here we have two girls that have big foreheads, but they look completely different from one another because the distribution of the facial features is different. and all the other proportions are different. And we spoke about the posture of the characters, so I am paying attention to that here as well. You can see, even in the reference photo, that her posture is a little bit awkward. I mean, maybe she's just a little bit shy and nervous that they're taking a picture of her, who knows, but it does seem so, a little bit, so I take that idea and I translate it to my drawing. So you can see that her neck is really short because she's pushing her shoulders up. I guess this is something people do when they're a little bit nervous, or maybe it's just as a result of her doing sports. I don't know, but this is a difference between her and the previous girl. And then she's letting her arms just fall naturally, kind of like swinging around her body. She doesn't have much control over them, or she just chose to relax them, I don't know. But this really helps to add personality and tell you what kind of a person she is. And when it comes to the anatomy of the character, notice how I am emphasizing the small ankles and the small wrists. In this case, the hand is really big, but the wrist is really small. So I draw the hand kind of like a square, and then I connect it to the wrist. Because the other option, I guess, would be to have really, really thin hands that are just naturally following the curvature of the arm and the wrist. And they are connecting very smoothly to the rest of the arm. But I choose to give her like really squarish hands because she's giving a sense that she's someone who is, I guess, not super feminine, or this is what I want to communicate with my drawing anyway. So I am straying away from the super, slender and feminine hands, but I go for something that is a little bit more blocky. Also, again, because I want to create this repetition in the design. And as we spoke earlier about the shorts of the cool dude, I'm also adding wrinkles to her t-shirt here because this boxy shape can really easily look super stiff, but adding these wrinkles in the shape can help to add a little bit more life and movement to it. And I think that's pretty much it for this design and for the entire video. I was hoping that I will be able to keep quiet a little bit more, but it turns out that this is just not possible, I guess. Anyway, I really hope that I didn't overwhelm you with information or repeat myself. I do know that I tend to repeat myself a little bit, but I guess it's also because this is the way I learn things better. When I see the same rule, so to speak, repeated in different contexts, so I can get a better sense of how it works. Alright, I'm gonna stop here. I had a lot of fun designing these characters, I'm not gonna lie. It was super liberating to work on something that is not just pretty girls with the same kind of generic proportions, no matter how hard I try. Because with males, I guess you can experiment more. And not just males, I mean, I also drew girls here, but they look like they have more personality than the usual pretty girl, which was fun. And I will definitely try to work on more things like that because it turns out to be really fulfilling. Anyways, let's stop here and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye guys! I just wanted to say thank you for being on my Patreon because it really means a lot to me. You allow me to do what I want to do with my art, which means a lot really, and I am incredibly grateful. So I just wanted to say that, and I will stop being cheesy now. Okay, bye bye. I really have to go now.